Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are continuing our reading of Don John's Ducats by Roger Pilkington. As in last episode, I am unfortunately recovering from a rather nasty cold, and so I apologize if my voice is not quite up to its usual standard, but I hope you will forgive me. I am continuing with my regimen of excellent Earl Grey tea, and hopefully by the time I see you again next week, I will be 100%. But until then, I will have to enjoy this tea. And enjoy it I very much do. But enough distractions. Talk of tea is not why we came together. We came to continue the story of the 4 members of the crew of the Ducats and their adventures. So let us jump right in with Chapter 6, The Soldier Poet. The crew of the Ducats were usually astir very early, but on the morning following their adventure on the Less, it seemed as though nothing could wake them. The hooting of the barges working down towards Dinant Lock, the shrill sound of a streamlined express locomotive roaring through the station across the river, the tolling of the bells of the church below the citadel, the grinding of the early morning traffic across the bridge. Somehow they managed to sleep through all of it. Tired out as they were with the canoeing, exhausted too by their efforts in climbing through the waterfall in the cave mouth, and finally made pleasantly and glowingly drowsy by the fine dinner to which Carol had treated them at one of the riverside hotels, they had slept for 10 hours without stirring, and the violent downpour of rain which battered and rattled at the deck for a couple of hours after midnight failed to wake even Michael, who was the lightest sleeper among them. When at last they got up for their morning tea, it was not early morning any longer. The church clock was striking 10. Jill was quite recovered, and the bruise on her head had already subsided so well that there was little left of it but a dark bluish patch, which in any case was hidden by her hair. She poured the water into the teapot and set it on the table. But there was not much point in regarding the meal as early tea, nor even as breakfast, she pointed out. "We had better think of it as 11s, and then we shan't feel so lazy," she said, as she set out the cups on the table. "That makes us early, instead of late."
"We must have another meeting of the ship's company," Peter said. "We still have to decide about that canoe. There was nobody down at the landing stage at Anserem when we dumped the other, so they still don't know that it's missing."
"They might never discover," said Michael.
"No, but we'd have to tell them. Of course, if it's insured—"
Peter stopped at the knock on the hatch. The clerk from the post office stood smiling down at them from the quayside.
"Bonjour," he said. "And how did you like the Less?" Jill had to laugh. "It was lovely," she said. "Yes," said Carol. "You were certainly right when you said we would always remember it." "And you saw the Chateau de Wanzin?" "Yes," said Peter. "Very fine, too." "But isn't it rather dangerous, having that hole there?" The clerk was puzzled. "Hole?" he said. "What hole?" Peter explained that right at the foot of the rock, some of the river disappeared underground. "There's no warning, and, I think, a canoe could be swept through." Their visitor nodded. "Now I remember. But generally, the hole is not there."
"Not there?" Michael said. "Don't tell me some days it's there, and some days it isn't."
"That is so," said the clerk. "If you saw the hole, it is because the summer has been very dry, and the river is very low. Usually the water is higher, and the hole is almost covered, so that no one canoe could possibly enter it. I do not remember when the water was so low before."
"Ah, that explains it," Carol said. The official felt in his pocket and drew out a letter.
"As you had not come for your mail, I have brought it to you," he said. "It arrived just this morning."
He handed it down to Carol and nodded. "Au revoir." "Au revoir, monsieur, et merci." Carol pushed the letter over to Michael. "It's for you." "Why, it's from the rector of what's-its-name," he said as he saw the writing. He slit open the envelope with a knife and pulled out the sheet of paper. "What does he say this time?" Jill asked, without very much interest. "Give us a chance," said Michael, eagerly scanning the lines. "If you want to know, I'll read it out. There's nothing particularly private about it." And he began to read. "Dear Mr. Branksome, after I wrote to you yesterday to send you the details on the gravestone I mentioned, your inquiry to Mr. Hickson, the churchwarden who lives at the Hall. He told me that Robert Whittingham had left an old book to his son, and he, Mr. Hickson, had picked it up at a local sale a few years ago. He only bought it because he saw the name and the address on the flyleaf. He's rather an antiquarian. The book is of no particular value, just a volume of old sermons. But on the flyleaf there's a verse, apparently written in Robert Whittingham's hand. As you're interested in the man, and there is a reference in the title to Namur, where you wrote from, I've borrowed the book and copied out the verse. Yours sincerely." "The poem is on the back," said Carol, who could see it from where she sat opposite Michael. "Let's hear it." Michael turned over the page. "There's a sort of preamble first," he said. "You read it, if you like." He passed the sheet across the table, and she took it up and looked at it. Then she read it out. "It is my earnest prayer that my son may learn these lines and repeat them each night. And if perchance in his manhood he do but reflect upon them sufficiently, he may find them to contain more wealth than doctor's learning." Then comes the verse. It was not a very long poem, and the writer did not appear to have bothered very much about metre, nor did it rhyme, and Jill thought it was hardly right to call it a poem at all. It was headed, "Adieu, Namur, adieu. Adieu. Each man stays till 'tis bedtime, nor has o'er life's abodes an even hand. 'Tis hence man is but a flower. Away, and let striving for once live easy, asleep." Underneath, in the same handwriting, were written the words, Robert Whittingham. In sickness, Camden Fitzmorton, 1816.
Not very interesting after all, Peter said.
No, I think it's most exciting, said Michael. It may contain more wealth than doctors' learning. See what I mean? It's a puzzle.
I don't see why it need be. People just wrote like that in those days.
All right. Yes, they did. But why is the poem headed Adieu? Goodbye, Namur, goodbye. Why, he had left the place ages before. We know that. The poem doesn't really seem to be about Namur anyway, Jill said. Exactly. Michael snatched up the sheet of paper. Listen, the ensign is supposed to have collared a lot of gold at Namur. He rushes out of the city and vanishes. Later he turns up at home, and soon he dies. But before he dies, he pens this ode, or whatever it is, and leaves it to his son, who's still a baby. As a young man, the son sets out for Belgium, but is killed along the way. If he wasn't coming here to find the gold, what was he doing?
That sounds straightforward, Peter admitted. But if the poem was a puzzle, and gave the answer, why didn't he take it with him?
Because he already knew it by heart. He had repeated it every night from the day he could read. Of course the thing's a clue. It stands out a mile. Just look at the poem. It's not particularly inspiring as a poem, is it? I bet the man who wrote it didn't just tear it off for fun.
It's very much what a man might write when he was depressed and dying of fever, Peter suggested.
Perhaps it is, Carol said. But what about the preamble? It says that if his son reflects on these lines sufficiently, he may find wealth in them. You can't pretend that any amount of thinking about what the poem actually says would make anybody wealthy. Not even wealthy in wisdom. It's just a lot of airy-fairy nothing at all. Put into modern language, what does it all amount to? She took the paper as Michael handed it to her. Just this, she continued. Goodbye. Everybody lives till he dies, and has no, control over his body, or the length of his life, it might be. So a man is just a flower. All flesh is grass, in other words, Jill put in. Exactly. Give up the struggle. Live quietly. Dead. Live quietly. Dead, indeed, Michael said. Obviously that's tripe, even for a poet. I'm sure it tells the whole secret, and I believe Whittingham Jr. sorted it out because he did but reflect on it sufficiently. If he could, then we can. There's no harm in trying. I'm going to learn those lines by heart and repeat them every night too. He looked round. Hands up those who think it's a clue. I don't say it is, but it could be, Jill said, raising a finger. It's certainly very strange.
I'm not sure either, Peter said. But the more I listen to that poem, if you can call it a poem, the more I agree it looks a bit queer. He, too, put up a hand. Me too, Carol said. I'm certain it's meant to say something. Then we're agreed. In that case, we can all learn the lines as our homework for Dinant, Michael said, and we can all reflect for days and see what happens. Or for months, said Jill. Or years, said Peter. But meanwhile, what about the kayak? That's something we must reflect about right away. Is it to be adieu, kayak, adieu, or what?
If we were to decide to get it out, how would we set about it? Carol asked. Would we hire another pair at Hoyette and run down the Less again? We could, Michael said. Or we might run the Dabchick into the Anserem and go up the Less in the dinghy. The lower reaches don't flow nearly as fast, and we could row up most of the way. It's only 3 or 4 miles.
There's a second weir, Peter said. Still, it isn't a big one. We could lift the dinghy over, I expect.
Or we could load the dinghy on the roof of a taxi, Carol said. Then we could drive to the nearest point. There's a lane running to the cafe where we had lunch. That's much the best idea, Jill said. Only we can't all get in the dinghy at once. Look, suppose we take a car, and 2 of us are dropped where we were picked up last night. That's not far from the river at all. The others can go on to the cafe or somewhere, launch the boat, and bring down anything we need. Then if we get the canoe out safely, we have 2 boats to come back in, at least as far as Anserem. Fine, cried Michael. Let's do that. We can take some food, said Carol.
There are lots of things we'll need if we're really going, Peter said. Are we?
He put it to the vote, and this time, too, everybody was agreed.
It seems a very unusual meeting, he laughed. No divisions at all. He stood up. Jill, you make the list, and when we've thought of everything, you can tick them off as we collect them. Right, and instead of getting our clothes soaked, I suggest we all put on our swimming things instead.
By the middle of the morning, the expedition was ready, and a pile of strange and miscellaneous gear was heaped on the deck. Michael had taken off the mooring lines, and secured the Dabchick with only odds and ends of rope and her own anchor chain, and 4 good long lines lay coiled at the bottom of the heap. There was a flash lamp with 2 spare batteries, the paraffin mooring light, 2 boxes of matches, a loaf and 2 knives, a rope ladder, the dinghy oars, 4 blocks of chocolate, a packet of butter, the hacksaw, Jill thought it might be useful, a long curved sausage, a hammer, a bottle of orangeade and a mug, the block and tackle and falls from the David, a waterproof kit bag, and, to satisfy Michael's curiosity about the animals he said were in the cave, there was also a shrimping net, a rubber baler, a slab of cheese, and 2 tins of sardines, a packet of candles, and a clothesline made up the list. There's the dinghy too, of course, Jill said. We almost need a lorry, not a taxi. And this was just what the first taximan also thought, when Peter brought him to the quayside, and told him where they planned to go with such a mountain of equipment. But he promised to inquire among his friends, and at last an old van appeared through the archway and pulled up by the Dabchick. A price was agreed which worked out cheaper than the car of the previous night, and only half the cost of returning to Hoyette and hiring another pair of kayaks. Then the loading began. First the dinghy was lifted to the quay and lashed on the roof, with the pair of oars and Michael's shrimping net. Peter squeezed himself beside the driver, and the others bundled themselves in the back, along with the rest of the equipment. Soon they were jolting away on the journey to Walzin, where Carol and Jill jumped out and made their way down to the weir. Here we have that strange and overloaded lorry carrying our heroes to their destinations. It's a cute little visual. I almost imagine it slipping and sliding along the road and having trouble with any particularly steep portions. "We'll have ages to wait," Carol said. "It will take them an hour to get to the river, launch the dinghy and steer it down here. It won't be as easy as canoeing. Let's cross over and sit on the other side." They took off their shoes and paddled across, not on the weir itself, but just below it. Beyond the strip of meadow, the log hoist still lay as the boys had left it the day before, and on the opposite bank the castle appeared, as deserted as ever. The two girls climbed the bank, but as the grass was still too wet to lie on, they sat on the weir buttress instead. "Carol," said Jill after a while, "Carol, that letter Michael got this morning makes things all different. You're sure it's some sort of clue, aren't you?" "It could be." "It is. I know it is." Carol turned her head in the sun. "But before today, you were quite sure Ensign Whittingham never took the gold at all," she said, laughing. "Yes, I know. I was wrong." Jill's voice was so definite that Carol stared at her curiously. "I suppose it was because of the way we learned history. You know what I mean, the Duke of Wellington or Marlborough, or the Battle of Crecy, or whatever it might be. It's always how brave and intelligent the armies were if they were British. Oh, they probably were, I know, but you never hear anything else, and so you find it hard to think that there could ever have been dishonest men among them. And there must have been hundreds or thousands. I didn't like to hear Monsieur Blanchard say that this standard-bearer, with such an English name and coming from a real, peaceful village up the Thames, had robbed the town. But that was just silly of me." "I don't know about that," Carol said. "It's better to think good of people, even if you're mistaken, than to suspect people who haven't done anything wrong." An interesting point, that, and an excellent point by Jill about the way that we often report history, particularly in the way that we teach history. It's very important to consider that there are two sides to every story, and that's only when the story involves two people. Everyone sees the world in their own special way, and no one ever thinks of themselves as the villain. Being mindful of that, and knowing what to look out for when you're studying history, can go a long way. And indeed, it can be very helpful when you're studying current events as well. "Yes," said Jill. "I often feel that too, and that's why I could never be a detective like Daddy. He says so himself. He says I would just be taken in. Michael's different. He always thinks people are crooks. You could see it when we first heard about Ensign Whittingham at Namur. Michael was so sure that he went down to the museum and then wrote straight off to the man at Camden Fitzmorton. And now we know he was right." "We don't actually know it," Carol said. "Well, if we don't, we're going to. We. You and me. It always seems to be Michael who solves these things and has all the bright ideas. This time I want us to do it first. We'll find out the secret in that verse between ourselves, and we won't tell Peter and Michael anything about it until we're quite sure." Carol laughed. "You are funny, Jill. But will you help?" "Of course, if you want me to. What are we supposed to do?" just solve the riddle. You remember the lines.
Not absolutely, Carol said. I know the general sense of them.
That's no good. I learned them word perfect while the others were getting in the ropes. Here goes. She repeated them right through. So I think we've got a start over the others. And all the time we're busy getting the canoe out of the cave, we can be trying to find the answer. I want you to learn the verse now, before the others arrive. Line by line, Jill repeated Ensign Whittingham's curious little poem, and line by line, Carol repeated it, until she had it by heart. Now, let's begin, said Jill. Let's take every other word. Say the lines to yourself, and speak it out the alternate words. Adieu, man, till bedtime has life's an hand, Carol began. That's no good. Let's try the others. Each stays, 'tis, nor, or abodes, murmured Jill. That's not much better either. How about the first letter of every word? A for adieu, E for each, M for man, S for stays, AEMSTTB. That's rather hopeless too. Unless one has to shift up or down the alphabet in some way, Jill said. We'd need a pencil or paper for that. I've got a pencil in my pocket, Jill said, but no paper, I'm afraid. Jill pulled on her deck shoes. There's an odd piece of newspaper where we got the rope yesterday. I remember seeing it. You stay there and I'll get it. There was still no sign of Peter and Michael with the dinghy, and at last Carol finished printing the lines in capital letters, all run together in a single row along the edge of the faded piece of paper. Come on, said Jill. It can't be all that difficult if the ensign counted on his son solving it without knowing anything else. It must be the first and last letters of each word, or something of that sort. I've an idea, said Carol brightly. Let's look for a word we would expect to find, and see if it's there. How about gold? Jill studied the long line of letters. There isn't a G till striving. There's an O a little further on, then another. Yes, an L too. Her voice dropped again, but there isn't a D anywhere after the first two lines. What a pity. Carol frowned. Try treasure, she said, and she began to point out the letters one by one. Certainly they were all there and in the right order, but not spaced in such a way that left much of the verse for anything else. They tried Namur, Muse, Buried, Bag, Don John, and several other possible words without any better success. Carol threw down the paper. I give up, she said. If Ensign Whittingham's son made head or tail of it, he was a bright lad. She stood up to glance upstream. Here they come. We've got other things to do now than try to crack a code. She waved her arms and called to the boys. Jill quickly tore the strip from the edge of the paper, crumpled it, and threw it into the river so that the boys should not guess that they had been trying to decipher the verse. Then she jumped up and saw the dinghy bearing down, with Peter rowing and Michael in the bows. "What a time you've taken," she said, as she bent down to catch the painter which Michael threw up.
"It's not so easy with the dinghy," Peter said. "You can't see what's coming when you're rowing with your back to the bows, and with all this weight aboard, it draws more water than a kayak. Still, we've got here. And now we must plan our campaign."
He jumped ashore, and Michael followed him. Peter and Michael had already thought up a plan on their way down the river, and they now began to explain it. First of all, the same fence post would be used as on the day before, and from this the rope ladder would be hung down the waterfall. A rope would be hung from it too, so that there would be something to hold at the bottom of the fall. One of them, perhaps Peter himself, would go down, and as soon as he was installed, the waterproof bag would be let down with the clothesline, containing first of all the flash lamp. The spare batteries would be kept until the next bagful in case of accident, and the candles and matches and the hurricane lamp would all be lowered to him in various installments. Anything which would come to no harm through getting wet could be sent down without the bag. The real difficulty would be to pull up the canoe, but Peter thought that if 2 or 3 lines were tied end to end, it might be possible to haul from the opposite bank of the river, where they could get a much better hold. The only remaining question was who was to go in the cave, and who was to stay outside in the dinghy.
"We shouldn't all go in," Peter said. "It needs at least one person, and preferably 2, to stay at the mouth to help haul the others out. I'll go in if you'd like to stay outside, Carol."
"Me? I'll go in. I know my way about in there." "So do I," Michael said. "I'm best at coming out," Jill said. "I think I should go into the cave too." All 3 of them looked at Peter.
"Which means that you stay up here with the dinghy," said Carol, laughing.
Peter couldn't help smiling.
"Yesterday everybody wanted to get out of the cave. Today you all seem very anxious to go in."
"Ah, but this is a bit different," Michael said. "Yesterday it was a mistake, and we didn't know what we were in for. Today we know all about it. Anyway, I don't see why we shouldn't all go in. It ought to be much easier to get in and out now that we have the rope ladder."
Peter looked doubtful. He felt that he should stay outside to help haul the others up, but at the same time, he ought really to be leading the salvage operations inside the cliff.
"I've an idea," said Jill. "We'll fix the rope ladder, and Carol and I will go down. Then we'll see if we can climb up all by ourselves and reach the dinghy. And if we can, well, everybody can come in." So it was agreed, and they all set to work. The long line was laid across the river and tied round a tree. The post was laid across the hole by Michael and Peter, and the rope ladder and a line were dropped down. "The hole doesn't look quite so large today," Michael said. "Perhaps the level is not down as far as it was."
"But there's still plenty of room to get in and out," said Peter. "Are we all ready? Then we'll go back and start ferrying."
They rowed over, and Michael climbed out to let Carol take his place. She was to go down first. "There's just one thing," she said. "How about lunch before we start?" "Why not have it in the cave?" Jill said. "If we find we can get in and out easily, we'll all go down and have an underground feast." "How super!" Michael exclaimed, dancing from one foot to the other. "We could easily ferry the food over and send it in by the diplomatic bag. Then we can have a lunch party by candlelight." Carol slipped off her shorts and climbed into the dinghy in her swimsuit. She looked up at the sky and noticed that a haze had come over the sun, while away to the southwest the clouds seemed to be gathering thick and dark. 1 or 2 drops of rain kicked up little rings on the surface of the river. The forest was strangely hushed, and the birds seemed to have stopped their gay singing. The swallows flew very low, just skimming the top of the stream. "We'd better hurry," she said. "It looks as though it might rain." Jill laughed. "I can't imagine why you're worried about being rained on," she said. "It won't make much difference if you're going to slide down a waterfall." Peter pulled out from the bank. "Try and hide my shorts somewhere dry," Carol called back. "And my shirt, too." Jill rolled them up and laid them under a bush. She took off her own and put them on top, and Michael did the same with his. The rope ladder made such a difference that Peter was quite prepared to allow the whole party to explore the cave together, and when all the stores had been lowered through the hole, Michael tied the dinghy firmly to the post and slid down the ladder in the cascade of water. Picking up all their belongings, the explorers tramped, in single file, down the bed of the stream, with Carol leading, holding the hurricane lamp aloft, while Peter used the flash to pick out the ceiling, which sometimes came down to within 2 or 3 feet of the water. And here we have the group, in their bathing suits, all headed into the darkness of the cave. While I see the practicality of going in a swimsuit just to keep one's clothes dry, I'd be very worried about all of that rock scraping against exposed flesh. I guess we'll see what happens. In the light of the lamps, the cave was astonishingly pretty. On either side of the watercourse glistened stalactites hung down, white and purple or pinkish. Some were folded and thin like curtains, others fine as a little finger. Still more were huge and heavy, reaching down to fuse with the more flattened stalagmites, which rose upwards from the rocks to meet them. 100 yards or so along the stream, and round a gentle bend to the right, they came upon the kayak, hauled up where Carol and Michael had left it the day before. "There we are," said Peter. "Where shall we have lunch?" "It's not very handy here," Carol said. "Let's go a little farther and see if there's anywhere a bit better." She led on round a couple of sharp corners, and came out into a broader cavity, like a flattened hall. Here the smooth rock rose very gently from the stream, and on one side there was a miniature beach of mud and gravel. Peter flicked the lamp around the scene. "Fine," he said. "Let's pitch camp, and if we want to explore farther after lunch, we can." "Good," said Michael. "I'm going to. And I want to catch a few of those tickly things, too." Leaving the shallow water, they laid out their assortment of gear on the smooth stone floor of the hall. Carol took the matches, lit a candle, held the match flame to its base to soften it, and then planted it firmly on a little flat stone right at the water's edge. "There," she said. "With that and the paraffin lamp, we can see beautifully. I think this expedition has been very well organized, right down to the last detail. We haven't lost anything, either. Pass me the tin opener, somebody, and I'll open the sardines." "We forgot the opener," said Jill. "Never mind," said Michael. "Hand me the hacksaw, and I'll soon have the ends off the tins." He placed his foot firmly on one of the flat tins, tightened the saw blade, and began to cut away with long strokes. Some of the oil ran out of the cut, but it helped to lubricate the saw. "That's done," he said proudly as he picked up the tin and bent back the end. Jill took it, and she shook out the fish onto a smooth piece of rock. She let the oil drain away, then scooped up the sardines and put them on the bread and butter which she had been spreading. "This is the best picnic I have ever had," said Carol. "It's exciting under here." She took the mug and bent down to fill it at the stream. "Who'd like a drink? The bottle of orange is at the back there."
"Not for me, thanks," said Peter. "I'm cool enough in my bathing trunks." He shivered a little. "It isn't exactly warm in here."
"I'm sorry we can't offer you central heating," Jill said. "You'll just have to put up with it."
"Oh, I'm not complaining."
"I should hope not," said Michael, sawing away at the second tin. "It's not every day that you're invited to lunch underground. I wouldn't swap this for a Lord Mayor's banquet." "Hear, hear," said Carol. She added some orange to the mug of water and raised it high above her head. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the toast of the Dabchick Subterranean Salvage and Exploration Corporation." "Hooray!" said Jill. "The chief stalactite will reply," Michael said. "Go on, Peter, that's you."
Peter swallowed the remains of a slice of bread and cheese. "Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began, "it gives me great pleasure to reply to the toast so eloquently proposed by the Archduchess of Less. This is indeed an occasion of the greatest...
Carol, who had just begun a sardine sandwich, suddenly spluttered.
"The greatest amount of metal sawdust that I've ever eaten," she said, wiping her lips on the back of her hand. "Your hacksaw does wonders, Michael, but it makes things a bit gritty."
"Explorers shouldn't complain," he said. "Go on, Peter."
"As I was saying," Peter resumed, "this is an occasion of the greatest—"
"Peter!" It was Jill who broke in. She put down the bread which she was spreading and stared at the candle which Carol had set on the stone at the edge of the stream. "Peter, I don't want to interrupt, but—" Following her gaze, they saw that the candle no longer stood high and dry on its little stone base. The stream was flowing around it, and nearly half of the wax was now under water. Peter scrambled down and pulled it away from the rock.
"That's queer," he said.
Jill looked around him anxiously. "You mean the water is rising?" Peter made no reply, but he held the candle near the water's edge. Michael had stopped sawing at the sardine tin, and he, also, was watching the little ripples in the patch of bright light cast by the flame. Carol moved forward too. There was silence for perhaps a minute, whilst they saw the level of the surface creep slowly up the sloping rock. Peter looked around quickly.
"We must move," he said shortly. "Carry everything up there."
He nodded towards where a fall of rock from the roof had left a gash which sloped steeply upwards for several feet from the mass of the rubble below.
"Get everything together, and well back from the stream."
"It must be because of the rain," Michael said. "We ought to have guessed that it might rise, particularly after the clerk said he could never remember the water being so low before." Jill began to gather up the food. You don't think we should go back at once? Shh! Peter held up a finger.
Listen.
Was it only imagination? Or was the sound of the torrent pouring in at the entrance louder than it had been a few minutes before? He took up the flash.
Wait here, he said. I'll go back and see.
And he began to pick his way between the rocks, following the bends of the watercourse. How high could it rise? Asked Carol as she collected up the candles and matches and other odds and ends. Michael picked up the hurricane lamp and examined the boulders. Quite a long way, he said. Look, you can see a sort of tide line of bits of grass and mud, halfway up to the roof. But if it should rise up there, Jill began. It won't, said Michael, more emphatically than he really felt. That line must be from the spring floods, when all the snow's melting.
Peter was quickly back. It's no good our trying just now, he said in a rather serious voice. The water outside is almost up to the top of the hole. It's roaring in like a torrent. You couldn't stand in it, let alone climb up and get out.
Then we shall have to wait, said Carol.
Yes.
How long? Said Jill.
I don't know. It might be a little time. Hours, certainly.
Then we must save our light, said Jill promptly. We can have one candle, but that's all.
Yes.
Peter picked up the hurricane lamp and blew it out.
I'm sorry about this. I should have realized.
Jill suddenly felt surprisingly calm. No, she said. It's nobody's fault. Anyway, the rain has probably stopped by now. I expect the water will stop rising and then go down again. Let's pitch camp up here and decide what we're going to do tonight when we're back at Dinant.
Back at Dinant? Peter wondered whether they would really be in Dinant so soon, and he knew very well that Jill was only saying this to keep the others from worrying. If the rain went on all day...
Peter, said Michael, we ought to go and fetch the kayak in here. We don't want it to drift away or get jammed and sunk.
Yes, we'd better.
While Michael and Peter brought the canoe round the bends and dragged it into the underground hall, Jill and Carol carried the rest of the equipment high up among the fallen rocks. It was a little warmer there, away from the spray-laden current of air which drifted down along the stream. "Make yourself comfortable, ladies and gentlemen," Carol said, trying to laugh. "This is the first-class waiting room, even if there aren't any cushions on the chairs." They sat down in a circle around the candle. "How about some kind of game?" Jill suggested. The time would pass more quickly, she thought, if they were occupied. "We could dance all night, like Don John when he offered Queen Margaret the bag of gold," said Michael gaily. "We've got a bower, even if it isn't decorated and there aren't any barge-loads of musicians to fiddle to us." He picked up the waterproof bag and bowed to Carol. "Your Majesty, I pray you to be so gracious as to accept this bag of ducats." Jill sat very upright and stared, not at Michael or Carol, but almost as though she was looking right through them. Her lips were moving, and she was holding her left hand on her knee, touching the tip of one finger after another with the forefinger of her other hand. Carol, who was within the middle of a curtsy to Michael, noticed the strange expression on her face and quickly jumped up again. Jill, what on earth? But Jill only shook her head and continued with her silent mumbling, still moving her fingers like a small child, counting. Jill! Again, no reply. Carol dropped to her knees. What is it? She asked gently. Hardly as she had asked, when Jill flung her hands high in the air, she threw back her head and let out a shout which rang to and fro under the roof. Ducats! They all stared at her in the flickering of the flame. Her eyes were bright, and a smile lit up her face. Ducats! She shouted exultantly.
Ducats? Peter said. Ducats?
Yes, ducats, she said. Well done, Michael. We never thought of ducats, did we, Carol? And that is where we end for today, as the crew find themselves very nearly on a cliffhanger. It's certainly an interesting situation in which to find oneself. I hope, for their sake, that the water does not rise much further. That could be rather dangerous. I look forward to finding out what Jill exactly has discovered about the old poem, and what the crew is going to do about their situation. I hope you will join me for the next episode of Soft Stories, when we find out together. Thank you so much for humouring me and my illness during this week. I really appreciate your patience. I hope that next week I will be back in full form once again, and ready to continue the story. Until then, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.